Welcome back, dear students. Sorry for any inconveniences that happened due to the electricity cut and also my mistake to reopen another Live Plus link. Okay, so I stopped it and reopened the supposed link through which we normally are connected online. So let's resume our lesson. Thank you very much for rejoining with me. This is Faisal Ahmed throughout the whole lecture with you. So today we are discussing a house for Mr. Biswas. Right, so throughout his life, the romantic and insatiable Mr. Biswas, who is prone to pride, disappointment, irrational optimism, and despair, Hotasha dreams of finding financial stability and the house for his family. When he finally buys the house he always wanted, it turns out to be a scam. The house is ill-constructed or badly constructed and nearly uninhabited.
I think I cannot hear you.
Of living. And Mr. Biswas is unable to pay his mortgage, his bank debt. His health declines, he gets laid off from the Sentinel, and he dies in a heart attack. In the prologue, Mr. Biswas's tale begins where it ends, with his friends, with his firing debt and beautiful but crumbling house, which he bought after one night-time visit that strategically hid its flaws. Still, it was a much better place to die than the Tulsi's house full of relatives. Although Mr. Biswas passed away with little more than the mortgaged house, at least he didn't die, as one had been born unnecessary and unaccommodated. Indeed, Mr. Biswas's birth was decidedly unlucky. At midnight, the most inauspicious of hours, he came out six-fingered and born in the wrong way. Pandit Sitaram warned that he would be a lesser, spendthrift and liar, that he would lead to his parents' ruin, and that he should stay away from trees and water. So নানা ধরনের কুসংস্কারে জড়িত হয়ে তার জন্ম হয়। পণ্ডিত সীতারাম তার ব্যাপারে অনেক কুলক্ষণীয় কথাবার্তা বলেছিল তার বাবা মাকে। ওকে, যে ছেলে খারাপ হবে, তার অপব্যয় করবে, মিথ্যাবাদী হবে ইত্যাদি ইত্যাদি। আর তার হাতের আঙুল 5টার জায়গায় 6টা ছিল। হ্যাঁ, এই ধরনের নানান জটিলতা নিয়ে তার জন্ম। আবার তার পরিবার, ফ্যামিলি, তার বাবা মা ছিল উদাসীন, তারপরে গরিব, সব মিলিয়ে আর কি জন্ম থেকে হতভাগা আর কি মিস্টার বিশ্বাস। So that he would lead to his parents' ruin and that he should stay away from trees and water. He receives the name Mohun. So the name হচ্ছে মোহন আর কি। But the narrator insists on calling him Mr. Biswas even from his earliest days. তো এই উপন্যাসের বর্ণনাকারী তাকে মিস্টার বিশ্বাস নামে ডাকে আর কি, যদিও তার ডাক নাম হচ্ছে মোহন, তার পরিবার থেকে এই নামে দেওয়া। His father Raghu was a miserly sugarcane worker who buried his earnings in jars underground and superstitiously insisted on staying home from work whenever Mr. Biswas sneezed. While his elder brothers, তার বাবা অনেক কৃপণ ছিল, সুগারকেন ওয়ার্কার ছিল, সে টাকা পয়সা জারের মধ্যে নিয়ে সেগুলো মাটির নিচে পুঁতে রাখতো ইত্যাদি ইত্যাদি, নানান কুসংস্কারে আবদ্ধ ছিল। তারপরে কুসংস্কার জন্য কাছ থেকে অনেক সময় বাসায় থাকতো ইত্যাদি ইত্যাদি। So while his elder brothers Pratap and Prasad joined their father in the cane fields, Mr. Biswas was too sickly, মানে মিস্টার বিশ্বাস শারীরিকভাবে দুর্বল ছিল, অসুস্থ ছিল আর কি, Mr. Biswas was তো তার ভাইরা তার বাবার কাজে সুগার কেনের ফিল্ডে জয়েন করছে, কিন্তু সে পারত না। And weak to work until his neighbor Dhari needed someone to look after his new calf. While he was busy gazing at a shallow stream, one day the calf wandered off and drowned. তো যাই হোক, বেচারা তার প্রতিবেশীর একটা বাছুর দেখার দায়িত্ব নিল, রাখাল হিসেবে কাজ নিল, কিন্তু সেটাও আর কাজ হলো না। মানে যখন সে একটা অগভীর স্ট্রিম বা জলপ্রপাতে তাকিয়েছিল, তখন ওই কাফটা পানিতে পড়ে ডুবে মারা গেল। Too afraid to tell anyone, Mr. Biswas hid under his father's bed until the whole village assembled at the lake. And Raghu began diving for the missing animal and the boy. Raghu হচ্ছে তার বাবা। He pulled up the dead calf, but drowned while looking for Mr. Biswas just as the protagonist arrived on the scene. With the neighbors hunting through the family's garden at night, looking for Raghu's buried jars of money, Mr. Biswas's mother, Bipti, decided to sell the land and move to her sister Tara's house in the town of Pagotis. In Pagotis, Mr. Biswas was fortunate enough to go to school, where he learned to read from the authoritarian teacher Lal and began a friendship with a local boy, Alec, who taught him to draw letters exquisitely. After getting kicked out of his Pandit apprenticeship with Jairam and his job at a ram shop with Tara's brother-in-law, Bandit, Mr. Biswas decided to work with Alec painting signs. তো তার জব ক্ষেত্রে সে খুব একটা ভালো করতে পারেনি, নানান জায়গা থেকে বিতাড়িত হয়ে শেষমেশ সে একটা পেন্টিং সাইনের এখানে অ্যালেকের সঙ্গে যে কাজে যুক্ত হয়। মিস্টার বিশ্বাসের sign painting took him to the Tulsi's magnificent Hanuman house in the town of Arwakas. তো তার সাইন পেন্টিংটা খুব ভালো ছিল আর কি, বিভিন্ন সাইন পেইন্ট করতো। এটা তাকে তুলসীর ম্যাগনিফিসেন্ট হনুমান হাউস বা বাড়িতে নিয়ে গেল ইন দ্য টাউন অফ Arwakas, where an intimidating man named Seth, যেখানে একজন ঘনিষ্ঠ লোক যার নাম ছিল Seth, hired him to paint signs in the Tulsi store. Mr. Biswas immediately fell in love with one of the Tulsi daughters. সে তুলসী স্টোরের তুলসী পরিবারের এক কন্যার প্রেমে পড়ে গেল। সে গার্ল অফ 16 named Shama, 16 বছরের মেয়ে যার নাম ছিল Shama, and wrote her love note, তাকে ভালোবাসার একটা নোট লিখে দিল। However, Mrs. Tulsi intercepted his note and to his surprise promptly offered him Shama's hand in marriage. তো মিসেস তুলসী মানে সেই শ্যামার মা আর কি, সেই নোটটাকে ইয়ে করলো, বাজেয়াপ্ত করলো, কিন্তু বিস্মিত ভাবে সে শ্যামাকে তার কাছে বিয়ে দিতে রাজি হয়ে গেল। He accepted the offer and immediately regretted his decision. তো অফারটা গ্রহণ করেছিল, কিন্তু সে অফারটা মানে সিদ্ধান্তটা সঠিক হয়নি, এটা নিয়ে সে পরে আফসোস করে। But nevertheless moved into an upstairs room at Hanuman House, where dozens of family members cohabitate in a tenuous but relative harmony. মানে বহু মানুষ একটা ছোট্ট বাড়ির মধ্যে বসবাস করে, এখানে বহু মানুষ থাকা মানে ঝামেলা বেশি, অনেক মানে বসবাসের অবস্থা খুবই লোয়ার ক্লাস টাইপের। Mr. Biswas immediately hated his new surroundings, antagonized as many Tulsis as possible, including Shama, Shama's sister Chinta, Chinta's husband Govind. sorry এটা বিড়াল ওরা জানলার এখানে এসে ভয় পেয়ে গেছে। Okay, excuse me.
তুমি কিন্তু চোর আছো
Okay, excuse me. So let me resume. Okay, so Mr. Right, so এখানে ছিলাম বোধহয়। Okay, Chinta's husband Govind, the devout and orthodox brother-in-law named Hari, and Mrs. Tulsi's two studious sons, whom she paid special attention, and he disparagingly nicknamed the two gods. After spitting and throwing his food onto Awad, the younger god, Mr. Biswas received a hearty beating from Govind and an order to leave the house immediately. মানে ওদের যে ঈশ্বর বা দেবতা সেটার সাথে কিছু বাজে আচরণ করেছে, উল্টো পাল্টা করেছে, এই জন্য তাকে বাড়ি থেকে বের করে দিয়েছে। After his eviction, Mr. Biswas went to a remote village called the Chase to run a new store the Tulsis had purchased there. Shama initially resented him for trying to paddle his worn canoe and landing them in a tiny house in the middle of nowhere. However, they began to find some common ground, and she soon became pregnant. Their daughter Savi was born soon thereafter, but business was turning sour at the Chase.
আমাদের ওই বারান্দায়ও ঢুকে গেছে এখন যাই
আচ্ছা। However, they began to find some common ground, and she soon became pregnant. Their daughter Sabi was born soon thereafter, but business was turning sour at the Chase. Especially given Mr. Biswas's willingness to sell to the townspeople on credit. Eventually, Mr. Biswas lost all his savings when a local stick fighting thug, Mungro, sued him for damaging his credit. With his whole family, Shama, Savi, and his new son, Anand, at Hanuman House, and his sense of isolation at the Chase growing, Mr. Biswas began to cherish the community he found among the Tulsis in Arwakas, and let Seth talk him into ensuring and burning down the store at the Chase. Mr. Biswas's next destination was Green Valley, an estate near Arwakas, where he worked overseeing workers under Seth. He found his work tedious and his home life in a tiny room in a shared barracks exceedingly miserable. His only solace lay in reading the newspapers that the resident before him decided to use as wallpaper. And he began dreaming of building his own house behind a grove of trees nearby. He unsuccessfully fought to claim Shabi from Hanuman House, and then, after a nervous breakdown that culminated in his attacking Shama, turned his attention to Anand, who agreed to stay. He had already invested all his money in constructing a rudimentary house from reclaimed materials with the help of a local builder, Mr. George McLean. While there, the father and son quickly found a shared affinity for literature, philosophy, and science experiments. But soon thereafter, after Mr. Biswas's puppy, Tarzan, showed up dead on their doorstep, a severe lightning storm tore the house to pieces, leaving Mr. Biswas again without a home. The Tulsi brothers-in-law brought him and Anand back to Hanuman house, where he recovered and began to feel safe and even a little adventurous, perhaps for the first time in his life. Although he was finally united with all his children, including two new daughters, Moina and the infant Kamala, Mr. Biswas walked out of the house with a small suitcase and no idea where to go. Mr. Biswas jumped haphazardly onto a bus to Port of Spain, where he stayed with his sister Dehuti and her husband Ramchand in their ramshackle house on the periphery of the city. He stumbled into the office of the Sentinel, a newspaper where an old friend from Arwakas worked for some time. Although it took him a day of unpaid sign painting to convince Mr. Barnett, the editor, to give him a shot at reporting, Mr. Biswas landed himself an unpaid month's trial. His initial stories about dead babies were uninspiring, but after Daddy comes home in a coffin, Mr. Barnett was impressed and Mr. Biswas became a full-time reporter. So সে পরবর্তীতে এখানে সাইন পেন্টার থেকে রিপোর্টার হয়ে গেল. Mr. Biswas's family agreed to move to Port of Spain and Mrs. Tulsi offered Mr. Biswas's family the same rooms in her vacant house there for only $8 a month. Soon a new regime took over the Sentinel. Mr. Biswas was no longer allowed to write sensational reports, but now was called to report not disturbed. Management assigned him to cover cricket matches and court cases, always in bare bones detail, and fired Mr. Barnett. With Mr. Biswas increasingly miserable, his children began reconnecting with their family in the countryside. First with Tara and her husband Ajodha, and later with the Tulsi at Hanuman house. Because of fights with Seth, the Tulsis abruptly decided to leave Hanuman house for an estate at Short Hills in the north of Trinidad. And Mr. Biswas's family got kicked out of Mrs. Tulsi's house in Port of Spain. Once again, Mr. Biswas came to live with the Tulsis, although this time he found it rather inoffensive, particularly because Mrs. Tulsi was again aging and indifferent. However, the glorious estate began falling into deeper and deeper disrepair, threatening the family's survival. Eventually, Mr. Biswas was forced out of the house after being accused of stealing. He promptly had his own house built nearby. Unfortunately, the family's attempt to burn the brush surrounding the new house led them to burn the house down instead. So unlucky actually overcome him. Luckily, however, Mrs. Tulsi's home in Port of Spain was again available, and Mr. Biswas moved back